Duck and cover.
Hello and welcome to Surviving Classical Music. I'm Andrew Byrne.
I'm Grace Newcomb.
And today we're talking to our very special guest, conductor and artistic director of the Frauenkomponiert Festival here in Switzerland, but also in the UK. She's also a violist and baritonist, Jessica Horsley. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Andrew and Grace. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I wanted to have you on here, Jessica, because, of course, I watched a significant portion. I was present live for the Frauenkomponiert Festival, which I very much enjoyed. And I'd like to hear your take on how you thought it went this year.
Wow, it was quite a year. I mean, the concerts were great, the broadcasts were great. There was some fabulous music that I hadn't known before, brilliant performances. But of course, it was all very complicated. We had to move concerts, musicians sitting a long way apart, limited audience numbers, all the stuff that we're very familiar with, safety concepts and COVID tests galore and all the rest of it. So we were in London this year too, so it's not just...
Oh, really?
Well, with the BBC, that's what it was all about. In fact, the BBC was supposed to be coming here for the orchestral concerts.
Yes,
Yeah.
I understood that much, but I didn't know that.
That's why I went in March, because I did the broadcast with the BBC. We had no public, but we did a live broadcast.
Oh, this is interesting to talk about.
Radio
as
3.
well. People will be interested in this.
It was brilliant. They were brilliant, but the circumstances were...
Yeah.
I mean, they had to be 2.5 meters apart.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
2.5 meters. So I had to change the program in December because I had triple woodwinds, and we didn't have space for triple woodwinds.
On the stage.
Yeah, and we're talking about orchestral repertoire by women composers in a pandemic, finding the materials, right? So I was in touch with archives in Australia, in America, and got it together. But it was, and then of course you get a manuscript, but that you can't just use it, right? You correct. So I spent, I did 40 hours of corrections on Kungshi, the piece that we did, 40 hours to check the parts in the score, because the stuff's never used.
Wow.
So it's very rare that you actually get somebody's printed good edition, and it's unfortunately it's more common that you get a printed score which is actually crud because nobody has really. I mean, Florence Price, that was the example, because it was a shimmer edition. I thought, okay, this will be fine, and there were a few things in the score which I didn't like the look of. A couple of things, like in the violins, there was a D sharp in the first violin, D natural in the second violins. Okay, it could have been either, but okay, I want to see the manuscript because I don't know which one it is. And when I got the manuscript, I discovered a ton of stuff. And so I went through the whole manuscript, and there was like the trombone was missing, the third trombone was missing in bar 8 totally, and you couldn't know that because the part was covered by another instrument. So I went through the entire score.
You went down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Just found everything.
Went 20 hours. Wrote to Schirmer, said this. I mean, if this were a Beethoven score, everybody would think it was a scandal, but it's not. It's Florence Price. And there was before we did our recording of that, because we were with SRF in Bern, right? So that will go out soon, so that's good, and that'll be right now. But the only recording was one done by the BBC, and it's got the mistakes in it. Or they, some of them, of course, were obvious, but they made a decision and they chose whatever it was. I think they chose the D sharp, and it was actually the D. It could have been either.
Yeah.
And that is the one recording that's out there. And it's just not acceptable. But unfortunately, that is...
Was that because it was just simply rushed, that the whole thing was done kind of very slapdash?
Somebody else didn't spend the 40 hours before the first recording going through the...
That was only 20. It was 40. It was 40
only
for
20.
Kungshi. No, what happened was, in fact, because that's the difficulty, if you like, they don't have it on the file because somebody gave it to them. Somebody did it. You don't know who that person is. It obviously wasn't done in an extremely scholarly way. It was just given to the Verlag, and nobody checked it.
And they just played what was on the page.
Yeah, I mean, they just took it, printed it, and
British
there you
style.
are. And of course, nobody plays it. So, I mean, Schirmer's based in New York, but the BBC took it, and I'm sure they were just probably sight reading, and it looked all right, and they changed a couple of notes, and that's all right. But I'm, of course, a bit more picky than that. Or once I'm a researcher too. I don't like it if something is not right on the page, and I think it's the least you can do. I think it's the least you can do is to get an or text, if you like.
Yeah.
But it just means, yes. Anyway, so that in effect, it was supposed to be the same program in March. I mean, the whole thing was supposed to be March, but it was supposed to be the same programme with the BBC 4 times, right? But I had to change most of the programme for the BBC. So we ended up doing 2 works by Glanville Hicks, the Australian composer, which was great. But so I had to check all those parts because that was handwritten stuff as well. And so Kung Shi we only did in June, for example. I was supposed to do that with the BBC, which was why it was all a bit silly because, I mean, doing Dorothy Howell with the BBC makes a lot of sense, right? But doing it with the Sinfonietta in Switzerland, that was the premiere recording, right? The world premiere recording. Yeah, it's fine, but it was all a bit sort of, no one would have conceived this from the outset like that, you know?
Right.
Right.
So, but the net result, Cecile Marty had to rewrite her piece for London too, because we could only have double woodwinds. So she started rewriting in December. So we did, in fact, 2 different versions of her piece. We did the Change of the Winds version in March with the BBC, and we did the big version here in June. And so the only piece that was actually the same was the Gibbs Symphony in both programmes. And so doing all that plus all the corrections plus finding actually the material in the first place and all the rest of it. So it was kind of, it was all a bit crazy really. And one of the nicest bits to this, right, okay, so I got to Britain, they let me through in Zurich, I did all the COVID tests, you know, because you have to test on day 2, day 5, day 8, you know, all the rest of that.
Yeah.
And we had to do the performance in Watford, in the Coliseum, because it was the only venue big enough, right? So we couldn't be in the South Bank, couldn't be, because everybody has to sit 2.5 metres apart. So you have this, I mean, I was prepared for the orchestra sitting a long way away, but I walked in and I thought, my God, you know, it's like, it's vast, you know, it's like being on a football pitch and I could barely see the horns at the back. Okay, good. But then I went to my dressing room and, you know, everybody was there, everybody was COVID tested, everyone had their temperature taken, everybody had walked in, you know, the safety brief, everything. It was like, and it was about 10 minutes before the first rehearsal and I was just about to go out and take my position and then knock on my door, managers turn up and say, we've got a problem. There's no water in the building.
What?
Yeah, right. Everybody had travelled out from Watford. You know, most of them live in southeast London. It takes you 2 hours to get to Watford, right? And there was a burst water main in Watford, typical British story, right? Burst water main. So the whole of the city had no water. And not only did that mean, of course, you know, nobody could go to the loo, wash their hands. This is a pandemic. This is not a great situation. But the air conditioning, which had to be on full blast, was run on water. So the first thing I said to the BBC Concert Orchestra when I finally, after all this, stood up in front of them was, it's really great to be here, good morning. And I'm terribly sorry to tell you that we can't rehearse. And so we explained and I said, would it be possible to do an extra hour tomorrow? Because we only had 2 days rehearsal, right? British Orchestra, totally unknown programme, some of it handwritten, you know, with all my corrections as well. And fortunately, Nate, my fabulous concertmeister, said, he sort of pleaded and said, well, can we just, you know, do an hour? Can we do 45 minutes? And they said we had 1 hour of water in the air conditioning, so we could do 45 minutes of rehearsal. So that's what we did, and it was brilliant. So we did the Gibbs Symphony just once through, you know, British sight reading, and then we did half of 2/3 of Cecile's piece, and then everybody went home, and that was the first day of rehearsal.
Wow!
But you could only do it of 2. And then we turned up the next morning, you know, and I rehearsed. I really pushed them really hard, but British orchestras are really fast, really good. They did a brilliant job, you know, but it was an interesting dynamic. And after that, I said, you know, I'll never do anything that difficult again, because, you know, there's obviously a fair amount of tension in all that as well.
Yeah.
And so, you know, little explosions in the orchestra. But, I mean, that's normal. You just deal with that. And they did a fabulous job. I mean, the first half of the concert, they played fabulously well. You would never have known, but these were the circumstances. So.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis. But
yeah.
But you managed the concert, everything.
Yeah, the broadcast was brilliant. They did a brilliant job.
The audience didn't know a thing.
There was no audience.
Oh, there's no audience. Okay.
It was simply radio. I mean, of course, we wanted audience. We wanted to do a concert,
Yeah.
but that wasn't allowed at the time.
Yeah.
So it was just me and the managers and Georgia Mann, who was doing the interview. Mm-hmm. She was doing the announcing and everything. So it was just us and the techies and the orchestra at vast distance, and there you go. But of course, you know, in this strange situation, what happens is you get to the end of the broadcast, it's fabulous, and you're not even allowed to go near anyone. You can
Yeah.
say hi and thanks very
Well
much.
done.
And then you go home and you have a drink by yourself, and that's it.
Yeah. That's really interesting that somebody even had to rewrite a piece for the restrictions. I haven't heard about that happening before, but it makes sense if you have the chance.
Well, they play without masks,
Okay, yeah.
and so that's why they had to be
Yeah, they had
2.5
to.
meters apart.
Which is a lot.
It's a really huge space, and for the strings particularly, it makes it. It's such a different experience to play. I mean, it's not easy for the winds, particularly for tuning, I think. But if you like, the percussion are used to being miles away from you, and if you've got a massive orchestra and a choir, and okay, it's not totally easy, but fine. But the strings are used to playing, of course, together, and they're used to playing really two at a stand and feeling into the sound together. Okay, it's an ensemble, they play together normally, so they're used to that. But for them, they suddenly feel like they're playing string quartet, but they're not. They're playing with the orchestra, and it's incredibly exposed for them.
Yeah.
I mean, they did a fabulous job. And one of the things that was amazing was the sound, the beautiful string sound, which was so homogenous, despite the fact that everyone was sitting, miles apart. But yeah, so
Adapted quickly. Yeah.
British orchestras.
Am I right to understand that this festival skipped a year?
It doesn't happen every year anyway.
Okay.
It takes quite a lot of organisation to set it up and everything. So it's not got a fixed rhythm. The last one was in 2018, actually.
So this was
one
the fourth one.
21. This was the fifth.
Fifth, okay.
Because in 20 we did just a small edition, just a
okay.
couple of concerts. Basically, if we get the orchestra together, then it's a lot more work on all fronts, basically. But a couple of chamber music concerts or something, it's easy to do if that's what you want to do.
But this year in particular was beyond what any other festival required
Yeah,
organizationally.
of course, because normally we would have just done it in March, and bringing the BBC over here. We were going to do a joint broadcast. The BBC were going to broadcast from here with SRF, actually, and so it was great. But yes, it was an international undertaking for the first time, and then of course because of COVID, then we had to move everything for logistical reasons, because the BBC couldn't come here, but I also couldn't be in London and come here doing quarantine in between.
Yeah.
All of that sort of thing. So we did think we might do the Sinfonietta concerts in February before I went to London, but it was just all too fast, too complicated, not enough time to change all of this, and we just didn't know where we were by then. So yeah, moved the stuff here to June, and we'll have some live streams in March and some now. But I mean, normally the festival's 10 days, and this time it was 3 months by the time we got everything through. So it was sort of this, but we were delighted to just get everything through in the end.
Yeah.
But it's, and once you're in, you just keep going, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It reminds me, there was this football game between France and somebody, I can't remember. With Zidane or whatever his name was, a long time ago.
I don't know. I don't remember.
And there was this interview afterwards, and he said, they said, well, how did you do it? And he said basically in French, well, on a commencé, on a continué. And that's basically, you're in it. And so, of course, you just keep going. I mean, there's all this work done, and it's all sort of set up. And yeah, but it was a crazy and difficult year for,
Go ahead. No, go.
No, I was just going to say you are quite active in the UK, but also here in Switzerland. So what's been the biggest challenge with the travel? Because the UK travel and Swiss travel, they haven't always been the easiest in the past year as well. So you said you had to quarantine. Sometimes you had to spare an extra 12 days at some point to try and make sure that you could reach a project in England in time. Is that the biggest challenge, or was there anything we don't think of on the surface with the travelling between these two particular countries?
I mean, it is the logistics as well, because it does make it very complicated. At that time, you could only fly to Heathrow, for example, which wouldn't have been my choice of airport for where I was going at the time. You could only fly out of Zurich, actually. You couldn't fly out of Basel. And so actually just the logistics of what you're allowed to do, plus the official COVID test, because it's not like you can just walk into a COVID test station on day 2. You have to actually set all the tests up through the government organisation before. So that makes everything just quite an organisational feat, I suppose. But clearing the time, I mean, you know, one just accepts that that's how it is, and of course, so much was sort of cancelled anyway that you just okay.
You could
well,
take
let's
the time.
yeah, well, let's do that then. But it was more the changing rules as much as anything else, because there was a certain time when you got back into Switzerland when you did have to quarantine, even if you'd been working. But by the time I got back from Britain, actually, if you had been working, then you didn't. You know, I mean, it was just the changing rules. And you, of course, once you were setting stuff up, you had no idea in 6 weeks or 3 months what it's going to be like. Yeah. And so it makes advanced planning, well, pretty impossible, really. But of course, you just have to keep replanning. And so it was more that. It was more the additional, you know, you've set everything up and then you have to reset it up because it's changed. So it's just like having no floor, basically. It's like moving house and having no floor for your furniture.
Mm. There was a study that was published in June about generally women in the arts in Switzerland, which I'm sure you're very aware of. And classical music was obviously the worst of all of the industries. And what I'm hearing just from you listing the things that you did in the festival versus the 2.6% of women composers represented in pieces that had been performed in programs in the last couple of seasons. It feels as if, talking to you, Frauenkomponiert seems to be the only place, you know, in this country where women composers seem to be on the program in a major way.
I think a major way and major festival is the point, because there are, you know, sort of little enclaves of people doing things, but it's usually, I mean, it's actually always chamber music. And that misses the point for me, because the whole point was, yes, women were allowed to compose, generally speaking, in the past a little bit, but, you know, if they were allowed to compose, then chamber music, please, because that's, you know, that fits what they're doing. And so the whole point of Frauenkomponiert was always putting the orchestral works in the centre, showing that there really were these works. And I always had the feeling that, you know, if composers, women composers, despite everything, really composed great orchestral works, despite all the odds, then the least we can do is perform them, right? And so these are in the centre. And that doesn't happen anywhere else. It's really, I mean, it's a huge thing to organise orchestral concerts if you're not part of the establishment, as it were. And so it doesn't really need an explanation that it's not there. But Switzerland is a very conservative country. It's a wonderful country in many ways. It's a country I'm very happy to live in many ways. But somebody did ask me recently, why do you live here? It would be much easier for you if you actually lived in Britain or in the States. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter where you live if you're travelling to work, except, of course, if you happen to be in a pandemic. But sometimes I do feel, you know, things are changing too slowly here. And I wonder if we need more political engagement, because the thing that would change things overnight, I mean, people say, yes, things are changing slowly, or of course there are the usual excuses, there's no repertoire, or it's too difficult to find, or, no, that's all rubbish. I mean, it's perfectly possible. But what would change things overnight is, of course, the money. Because if every ensemble, so the established orchestras, everything else, if they had to put 20, 30, no, you know, it doesn't even have to be 50% of women composers on their programs. If they wanted to get state funding, things would change overnight. Yeah. Which brings us perhaps nicely also to the theme of women conductors. Because in Scandinavia, for example, they now have quotas where it's 50-50. 50% male conductors, 50% female. And that's how you change things, of course. So things are much easier in the UK. I mean, certainly working with the BBC, because they're taking diversity really seriously, actually. I mean, it's taken a while, and, you know, we know that's not the only side of the BBC, or that things that had to change, let's say. But they really do take it seriously. I think they really are deeply committed to having works by women and having works by, you know, non-white composers of various. I think they're really serious about it, and of course that makes it much easier to work in that sort of situation. I mean, there's a genuine enthusiasm here. Some of it just doesn't make any sense to me. Some of it just doesn't make any sense. If it's really great music and the orchestra come time and again and say, "This is fabulous. Why don't we play this?" It's you know, and I often just don't have an explanation. It's one of the players, who I won't name, wrote to me after the concerts here when we did the Ruth Gibbs Symphony. Now, there's a lot of music by Ruth Gibbs, and she was British Swiss, right? Her mother was from Basel.
Really?
She grew up in Britain. I didn't even know that when I programmed her. It was just her anniversary year, 100th anniversary. And so I wanted to put something by her in the program. I thought that the symphony was just a fabulous piece. And it has this bit in the march that you know well, Andrew, where the piccolos and the side drum, and it's totally Fastnacht, right? It's we all recognise it, the piccolos and the drum coming in, and there's this enormous build-up, and it's just a fabulous piece. And I was corresponding with the daughter-in-law of the composer who lives in Breton, and she said, by the way, you did know that Ruth Gibbs' mother was from Basel. And I said, no, by the way, I actually didn't know that. And it's just a no-brainer. She should be performed by the symphony orchestra on a regular basis. It should be part of the standard programme here. And I'll be going to talk to them and suggesting that it should be.
Yeah, great.
But, you know, it seems a pretty uphill struggle some of the time. And it defies reason. But I suppose you have to go back to the whole context if you want to look at it. I mean, we look at the context now and we think, in most orchestras, there are quite a lot of women and quite a lot of men, and so it seems like it might not be really an issue. But if you look at some old footage, someone like Carlos Kleiber, for example, early Carlos Kleiber, a fantastic conductor, the early Carlos Kleiber, and he's conducting an orchestra. There's some fabulous stuff on YouTube. He's conducting an orchestra where there is one woman sitting at the back of the seconds, and Carlos Kleiber, rehearsing very nicely, says all the time, he says, meine Herren, my gentlemen. And he doesn't notice. He's not at all trying to be funny or not including someone. He's just, probably quite liberated for his time, but that is the time he's in. And I wonder how that woman at the back of the seconds felt by being addressed or not addressed as meine Herren, or just being the only female player in an orchestra. And so if you put that into the context, it's not so long ago that actually orchestras were totally male. And then, of course, there's the thing about leadership, directing. Okay, we know about that. There's glass ceiling and everything else. So, okay, conductors, it takes a bit longer to filter through, and composers. I mean, so if you put into the context, perhaps it's not so surprising. But I think we're just missing so much. I think this is our mutual heritage. I think great music is great music. And I think that one performance less a year of Beethoven something is okay for me. I wouldn't want to miss it. Great. I wouldn't want to miss Brahms, Shostakovich, Ligeti, Boulez, whatever. For me, it's all great. But it's just only part of the story. And it's so much richer. It's so much. I mean, these are brilliant works. And getting to know a work like this, it's just, for one's life, it's hugely enriching. It's enriching. But getting back to the member of the orchestra that wrote to me about the Gibbs Symphony, she said, I find it, she wrote in German, but she said, I find it embarrassing that and even more so, that the city of Basel does not know this music, does not know this composer. And that's it.
It's quite astounding, really.
Totally. There are 5 symphonies, There are overtures, some of it's in manuscript, we're working on editions. But,
Maybe once it's in edition form and you bring it to the forefront of it, some people will jump on it as a new thing.
Maybe.
I feel like in Basel, or maybe it's Swiss-wide, it is probably quite conservative here, generally speaking, but there are pockets of people who try to get funding for special projects, So you can get funding for stuff. Especially projects which maybe aren't so mainstream. And I feel like something like this would be a success story for applying for Swiss funding as well. So I hope she can, have her name on the canon here at some point soon. Sounds like it will go that way, hopefully.
It certainly should. But we shall see. I mean, I've heard before from the establishment, people want to hear what they know.
Exactly.
And I just don't think that's true. I don't think actually most people know that much music very well. And I think they're always open to hearing one other piece. You can always put something unknown with Beethoven or I think anyway, in every orchestral program, there should be one contemporary piece, just short. Doesn't matter. I mean, short is fine. But because if people never hear it, they're never going to get used to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And particularly if you start then introducing stuff on the stage a little bit of an introduction to a contemporary piece, people have come up to me and after a concert and said, "Wow, I don't like contemporary music, but that was amazing."
Yes.
And it's not about, of course, if nobody has a way into this kind of stuff, then of course they don't know how to hear it. You have no context, but just a little way in, just a few sounds to listen out to, or a bit of an orientation about what the brass are doing or whatever, goes a hugely long way. And I don't think we do enough work on just accessibility in normal concerts. I have a bit of a problem with the typical concert format where we all turn up, everybody's on the stage, the audience sits there, we bow, we play, we go out, that's it. It doesn't really do it for me. But of course, if you've just got a couple of players, you can do different formations and stuff, but you can't really do that with an orchestra and, that sort of thing. But I think that at least talking, because then it's not a barrier, then it's not, we're here doing our very important thing and you're just sitting over there and it doesn't really matter who's there. I think in the pandemic, we really realised how important it is to have a public and how different that makes the atmosphere and how much for me, it's a shared experience. Yes, I might be waving my arms at the front and I might be doing the talking as well, but it's about us finding a way into this music. It's about, and of course then particularly if you're doing music that is not known, to talk about it a little bit, just to give a little way in. I mean, I think that gives an amazing concert experience. I think people would be more open to it, but I wonder, managers, are they open to it? Are they open to the new research? Are they open to, I don't know. It involves a bit of questioning of oneself, doesn't it? If one is, Andrew, a white male looking at other possibilities, I don't know, does it?
I think also in the, just to add another element to this dimension, which is a little bit uniquely Swiss, let's say, is that we have a situation with this symphony in particular, that we're actually relying on someone a Swiss person might recognize as not Swiss to teach them about something about themselves, right?
Well, I've become Swiss.
No. But what I mean is that that it wasn't clear that this wasn't even a Basler, like that she had a connection with Switzerland until you get to the point of almost performing the piece for the first time. And suddenly we have this realization that not like, wow, this is something. And then just the detail of she had history and she has a lineage to Basel. That whole flute, the whole Fastnacht bit becomes
sense,
wow, that's our thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But if this is a British composer, we go, I don't know really what that flute and drum thing was going on in the middle.
Yeah.
And suddenly we have this moment where, as we can talk about white male or whatever, but also uniquely Swiss situation where you have this moment of someone that you think is the other, and then it becomes your own, and it becomes something which you realize you see yourself in something which you saw as foreign before.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, the perception of the other or what actually the other is, I mean, there are all sorts of different nuances about this, aren't there?
Yeah.
The connection with that Fastnacht bit, I mean, I have no idea whether she was actually here. I mean, but she must have been. And that's the thing I find so fascinating. She must have heard it because we all know, because we have spent so much time with the piccolos going around us as well, right? But when you hear that, you just know she must have been here. She must have experienced it. And I mean, this would have been the perfect piece to open the Stadtcasino here, right? No? And of course, that wasn't on the programme. It's such an obvious thing. And so it would just be fabulous to be able to open things out, to be able to, because I think it's truly enriching. I think it's not about, losing things. It's not about, nobody needs to be on the defensive. I think it's about really an enrichment for all of our lives, as well as I do think actually something to do with justice, because it's not fair, if you like. Now, what's fair and fair for whom and all the rest of it. But there is no reason. There is no reason except for history. That's not a great reason, though. There's no reason now why we can't actually change things if we want to. And I think rather than saying, yes, things are gradually changing, actually we could change it tomorrow.
Yeah. If
Today.
the money were there, then it would change.
Well, it does have a lot to do with money, of course.
Yeah.
It does have a lot to do with money.
But there's also a fear. I mean, that part of the programming decisions is there has been very little attempt at really cultivating an audience which had very little contact with classical music today, and trying to develop a whole new segment out of the population. What has been done is we need to double down on the people who have been in the classical music world for such a long time, and now they're number one. There's a huge generational shift happening.
Yeah.
Like, you know, the pyramid is starting to the upside down pyramid is dying off at the top end, and you can hear this. I mean, I get this a lot from people who are church musicians. They're saying that the choirs are all retired. You know, everybody is retirement age, with a couple of exceptions.
As we found out during COVID, yeah.
Right, and suddenly, well, what happens in 20 years when, unless there is a concerted effort from the churches to get more people in the choirs. You know, for example, this is not the orchestral audience, for example, but I think that's the problem, is that there's this doubling down, and in the end, that means no adventurous programming whatsoever.
Yes, which is slightly shooting oneself in the foot, isn't it? Because that's not helping. Whereas opening out, in fact, and making, for example, a program which would be interesting also to women's groups or something, seems to be a way of opening out and to gaining perhaps a new audience. I mean, I'd be interested in all sorts of crossovers. I think it would be great to do also jazz, pop, classical crossovers, that sort of thing, getting a different generation involved. And in a sense, it's different remits, but it's all part of the same thing. I think fear is involved. I think fear of the unknown, or fear of losing control, or losing one's own power, which is what happens when you start questioning the status quo, when you start questioning the usual programs that we have. And I think things are packaged often to, you know, this is this most amazing and interesting, and is it? Or is it just actually more of the same, but it's a different name at the front? Is it something really?
But this is why your idea of sneaking some new things into a sort of standard program, a canon program, is really good. That's, you know, we have to get people familiar with what feels new. And if you say Beethoven, Mozart, you know, whatever, and then we're going to feed you something you might like as well. And then the more times you manage to do that, the more people will recognize the name. They'll say, oh, I like that one. I heard that, you know, in a whatever, and then it grows. But if you say we're going to have an entirely new program, it's only contemporary music, or it's only women composers, then you're, in a sense, you're only reaching people already interested in that topic, I suppose. And then you're sort of limiting the growth of that bubble of interest. So that's a really good idea, you know. Feed it in bit by bit.
Yeah, I mean, let's say one program one piece by a woman in each program, one contemporary piece in each program, short, and there we are. So it's not exactly rocket science, is it? And I think audiences would be fine about that. I think, you know, that's a huge generalisation, but standard classical music audiences in Switzerland, they know some repertoire, but not really a huge amount. They're not. I don't think it's really going to make a huge difference to them whether there's a Berlioz overture or a Gibbs overture, actually. You know, I don't think they're going to come or not come because of that. They might come because it's Brahms' Violin Concerto, that's fine, but let's put that on the programme with something by Peggy Glanville Hicks, or, you know, I think...
bring them in with a hook, and then also offer them something new.
I just give audiences more credit. I think they're more open. I think if it's a good piece, I think if it's performed well, I think if it's presented well, I think they'll be open to that. I think I just.
I'm sure they will be, but they have to buy the ticket first.
Yeah,
don't
exactly.
They?
That's the stage to get to.
And that's probably the tricky bit, because, like you said earlier, we cling to familiarity. You know, it's human nature to have seen something a few times, and to say, oh, I know that, maybe I like it, even though you haven't really thought about if it's your favourite thing or not. You know, it's familiarity, so I'm going to go with that. So we probably have to use that as well, use that to our advantage in a way, to show them things that they will also like, that they have no idea that they like yet, or that even exist yet. And in a way to put some of this contemporary music, or women composers, or minority composers, or anyone who's underrepresented at the moment in the canon concert scene, to put them in one of those concerts among the standard names, is to treat them as though it's to act like it's normal anyway. And that's the stage we want to get to ultimately, that it feels normal to have those composers on the programme.
Yes, although, I mean, there's a bit of a danger in that it's sort of, if you like, accepting the male white hegemony, and we put a couple of other bits in it, which is not really quite the right dynamic either, is it? I mean, a truly diverse program should have as standard all these things on it and in equal, measure, if you like, or equal. So we're not expecting as standard the white male program, and we put another couple of things in it. So I think... I think it is more of a shift probably than that, but that would be a nice intermediary.
A stepping stone.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, I mean, it really asks us major questions about society, that kind of shift, about who controls power and who, of course, it's one microcosm, it's one particular world, the classical music world, but it's representative and a very visible version of what's happening in the rest. So I think that what we're aiming for ultimately is not just adding it in, but actually something which is much more, intrinsically diverse, inherently diverse, and just.
Yeah.
I guess my question is exactly on that, to counter that point, is where you have, when we're talking about power and how the orchestras we're talking, like the sort of organizations we're talking about, how they receive their money, that is behind a curtain of private foundations run by an older Swiss generation, which have different values which we don't even know. How do we counter that? It's different in the UK or in Canada, where you have maybe state public funded institutions where there's a council maybe of people who have a certain qualification or have certain experience in the art realm who help make the decision who gets the money.
Yeah, that it is a different system, but here, don't forget, there is a lot of public money as well. So yes, there are foundations and they are private entities and they can choose their own criteria. They can do whatever they like. I mean, within the law, but I mean, they can do whatever they like.
Sure.
But no, the public purse is extremely important. I mean, do you know how many millions the symphony orchestra gets given here per year? It's a massive amount of money, and a lot of this is public money. So if you wanted to, and prohevizia, all these kind of things, this is public money, this is the public purse. And so just making that with a certain quota of... The problem is, of course, if you're going to make a 20, 30% quota for women, music by women, then what about minorities? Then what about, I mean, where does it end? And somehow that's still not an excuse to do nothing. I mean, doing something is better than nothing. And I think it's a bit of a blunt instrument, a quota, but again, better than nothing.
Yeah.
But no, if one linked solely only the public purse money here to actual more diversity, Gleichstellung or whatever you want to call it, then no, it would have an enormous impact. It would have an impact overnight.
Coming from a difference in generation, I wonder if over time, my own background, in 15 years that I did in musical education from a child until, finishing here in my studies, of the 5 one-on-one tutors, that I had for composition or theory or bassoon performance, 4 of the 5 were women. And I have only played in ensembles which are at least, obviously not in line with the statistic. We're 50% men, women in the groups that I have, in my own experience, played with. My most important orchestra was led by a woman. When I saw these statistics, it was a surprise to me because in my own experience, it was very different. And of course, in the freelance scene, which is not the area which is polled in this study, the freelance scene is much more equal. I don't know if it's 50-50, but there are far more women who are visible. In the leadership role, it's still there's still an imbalance in that direction. But what I find funny about this situation is that I can't help but think, well, you know what? In 20 years, it will just change, because I naturally see women as absolutely capable, and they have been in leadership roles my entire life. They have always taken an important role in my own education and so on as director. So I feel as if it wouldn't be a surprise, or it wouldn't be a negative, if it became 50-50. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. But you grew up in Canada.
I grew up in Canada, and some of these people were here. Like certainly the orchestra I played under and my most important like graduate studies one-on-one tutor were both women in this country.
And did you just study early music here, or did you study modern as well?
I studied early music here.
Yeah. So I think there are different contexts there.
Yeah.
But generally, I mean, if anybody knows something about the composers that I've been looking at sometimes, it's an American, because I think the syllabuses are, I mean, a North American, let's say, we'll put the continent there, right? Sure. I think the syllabuses are slightly more open there. And I think that actually the opportunities for women conductors are better in America than in many other places. There's more, there are more opportunities. So I think, and I think the early music context is again different. I think it's just you're talking about much smaller ensembles, and so there are hierarchies, but it's less of a power thing.
Right.
There's less money involved, and there's less, if you like, status of standing at the front. I mean, it's a slightly odd thing anyway, because of course, conducting a Baroque ensemble is actually a non sequitur, right? Because it should be either led from the harpsichord or from the violin, from the first violin, and so it's a different context anyway. I think. I mean, think about all of the Swiss orchestras. Can you name any woman chief conductor of any of these ensembles? And actually, I read a statistic that it's a lower proportion of women than in the army here. And which again puts it nicely in perspective, doesn't it? But it's not actually much better in a place like Germany. I mean, it's 3% women conductors in official positions in Germany as well. Although, of course, in Germany there are a wonderful number of orchestras and theatres, because every region had its own opera house and concert hall, and they've all stayed. Musical life is, or at least was before COVID, really flourishing. But still, the percentage of women is tiny. I love the late great RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was often asked how many women should be on the High Court until we have equality, right? And people were expecting either 4 or 5, because there are 9 judges, and so they were wondering which way she would go. You know? And she said 9. Because we've had 9 men for so long, right? That if we have 9 women for however many 100 years, then we'll have evened things up a little bit. And I loved the idea, because of course we think it's ridiculous. It would never be possible. That would be total discrimination. But that shows how much has to change in our minds. It goes so deep, and so much of discrimination is really hugely in our subconscious and all the rest of it. I mean, it goes really deep. And so just imagine, can you imagine every orchestra in Europe conducted by a woman? Crazy picture, no? Wonderful picture. But that's what we've had. We've had every orchestra until, I mean, there are, the very few exceptions there have been. And there are a few exceptions now, that's fine. But that's the picture we had. So there's a huge amount to change. And in fact, often when people meet me sort of socially for the first time, and they ask what I do, and I'm a conductor, and they're oh wow, that's interesting. That's always the first comment. And the second comment is often, oh, I've never met a woman conductor before, or oh, I don't think I've ever seen a woman conducting before. And it's so this male image at the front is very strong. It's very strong. But I think, the orchestras I've worked with, some might be different, but I don't think they care at all whether you're a woman or a man. I think they just want to be really conducted really well. I think they want somebody really competent who knows their stuff. I don't think they care about anything else. So there's a sort of a different mentality in the orchestra to what you might find perhaps amongst the management. Where it still tends to be a little bit of an old boys club, I think, and one is safe in one's own context. Yeah, and this, I know that you have experience with choir, the choir tradition, choral tradition in England as well, and I feel like this is one of the things in England that's still very, very strong, is the singing, the choral tradition with boys rather than girls. So we both sung in quite traditional, choir context in England.
But I was at a cathedral where it was one of the first to allow girls to sing. And the thing is, when you train the boys from a young age in that music, they are the ones that go on to direct, to be organists and choral conductors, which is huge in the UK. You know, that's a huge part of our music scene. And I was also always met with surprise when people learned that I was the organ scholar of my university college and that I was the one conducting the choir, like a girl organist. Yeah, that's really weird.
Yeah.
And that happened for me because there was I mean, hopefully I passed the interviews anyway, and you know, but I know that they were very supportive of women in leadership roles in my particular college. And we had a female chaplain there as well. And she didn't warn me that this was going to happen, but you could see that she was quite happy with helping the girls get through the leadership sort of that phase of feeling like you're out of place. You know, she was very, very good with this. And every meeting that we would go to, every organ scholar meeting, there would be jokes made about me, which at the time I thought were funny and flattering, and now looking back on it, I'm like, this is a bit weird.
This is actually discrimination.
Yeah.
And in Britain, of course, it's always got a little humorous element, but actually it's not fine. Yeah.
And I perfectly enjoyed the attention at the time as an undergrad student, but sometimes I think, I hope things aren't the same for the other girl organ scholars now. You know, the other female conductors. At university and then in later life, because I did always feel a bit different.
Well, it was a similar situation when I was at Trinity, Cambridge, and there was sort of in our cohort there was one female organ scholar as well at Sydney in the whole, and everyone else was a man. And in fact, I played the organ too. It wasn't my first study, but I could have easily auditioned as an organ scholar, but it didn't even occur to me to do it. In fact, which is also, I think, yes, telling. And Trinity had only fairly recently introduced women instead of boys. They swapped from one to the other, which is interesting too. And in my time, the ratio of men to women in Trinity was 1 to 7 students. Yeah, now it's actually 50-50. Wow. But at the time it was 1 to 7 because it was very strong on maths and physics and those kind of things. And it was very much the traditional, it was one of the most traditional colleges. And so as a woman in that context, you still felt pretty out of place or pretty, you were a slightly odd species, in fact.
So you mean 7 men to 1
7
woman?
7 men for every 1 woman in the student population. You know that story of Virginia Woolf? She was visiting Trinity. She was visiting a fellow at Trinity. And the fellow had an appointment. So a fellow is a professor, a lecturer at Cambridge. And she had a bit of time to kill, and so she thought she'd go and take a look at the library, right? Virginia Woolf, fairly famous author, right? And so she got to the library door, and there was a notice stuck on the library door, Trinity College Library, saying, women are allowed into the library only accompanied by a fellow.
No.
And there's a wonderful passage in her writings where she muses about, well, what do they think we're going to do? I mean, write, use pencils and write in the margins of books, or, I mean, how dangerous do they think we are?
Amazing.
And that's not, again, it's not that long ago, It's not long ago that there are no women in any of these colleges. There were just certain colleges where women were allowed.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, it's sometimes surprising how recent these things are. Yeah.
And yet that shouldn't be an excuse, because things can change very quickly. Things have changed very quickly. And one of the things that I think makes the debate incredibly old-fashioned is where we are now. I mean, we're talking about non-gender specific climate. We're talking about all sorts of choices about gender, sexuality, and I think sometimes we haven't even got to the stage where we can, give women equal rights. I mean, this should have been 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. That's how behind we are in the music scene.
Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, especially in this country, but I think across Europe, it's blatantly obvious that everybody in the arts it might be unbalanced, but they are far further ahead than classical music is. That almost no work has been done in a way the thing is that I think we are all trying to find where the where is this discrimination located in this system? It's somehow, it's behind a curtain somewhere. That is it money? Is it like an agency executive and executives level? Is it just a fear of change in general? Is it a fear that the audience is going, and we need to do whatever we can to keep them? It's so unclear as to.
I think it's always a combination of factors, isn't it? And I mean, in different contexts, perhaps one of those things you mentioned is more important than some of the others. But I think also a basic lack of imagination. I think a basic sort of this creativity, which programming is about for me, that can often be lacking. So really, just I think it really does involve some introspection, if you like, some really looking at your own prejudices. Of course, we are all incredibly enlightened, whatever artists, and so of course we like to think that we're totally egalitarian and totally open and totally whatever. But it's actually only if you start looking at your own prejudices that you can really, I think, genuinely look at those kind of things. But I also think, in a sense, it's sort of self-perpetuating because. Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps a bit sad, and it's a generalization. It's certainly only part of the story. But let's say whether women are represented or not might be more important to women generally, or you might feel more personally affected by it. And therefore, if we don't have any women managers or enough women managers, then of course that's going to be very slow to change, because somebody might think this is vaguely interesting. But if they're a white male, I mean, they might not necessarily feel directly passionate about it or directly affected about it. It's a generalization, and I think with Frauenkomponiert, it's been always really important that we have men and women working on the project, because for me it is about something for all of us. It's not a group of feminists just doing their thing. I don't find that interesting. But so I think if you want to look at those kind of things, I mean, I think that, let's say it's interesting that one of the people who got interested in Frauenkomponiert and what I'm doing happens to be the Intendantin of the Tonhalle, and that happens to be a woman, Ilona Schmiel, and the orchestra who we found in Switzerland who were interested in taking on the jumping in for the BBC CO when we couldn't get them here for the festival because of COVID, happens to have a Geschäftsführerin and a business manager, and who happens to be a woman. This may or may not be significant, but yeah.
Well, I think if you're a woman, then your ears are going to prick up probably more often when you come across these things. But I think it's really important that men are involved in the process, because otherwise, it's that's the way to to normalize it as quickly as possible. Because I think often, if you weren't aware of people trying to make changes, it might not come to your mind. It might not come to the sort of forefront for you. But if you're involved, then I don't think any men that I know in our scene would fight against that. They'd be in on it, but they kind of need an invitation sometimes, I think.
Well, one of the main things going outside of what I've said was my own experience, is that despite my experience with having women in sort of leadership roles in my musical career or education, the curriculum itself was just male.
Yeah.
It's purely male.
Yeah.
And the only exposure I had to female composers were either given to me in a situation where it was a female director who said, we're going to play this, or it was a female colleague who said, I want to play this music of this female composer.
Yeah, and that is a little bit typical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's face it. But I mean, great that you were open to that, and that you're sitting here and it interests you. I think that's great. But an interesting question is, when did you notice that you weren't playing music by a woman? Because I think, looking at my own prejudices, I think it's amazing that for so long it never occurred to me. Yeah. I just accepted the status quo as well. I was conducting Prokofiev and Beethoven and Shostakovich and whatever, And it took me a long time to think, hang on a minute. isn't there stuff by women? And of course, I hadn't had it in my education. Okay, I'd been through Cambridge and all the rest of it. And I mean, I'd studied in 5 countries, all sorts of instruments. I mean, it's, it was a very privileged education in multilingual in many subjects. And I mean, the fact that it only occurred to me pretty late on in my conducting training to think, wow, maybe the question, I'd like to conduct something by a woman. Is there anything?
Yeah,
Are you serious? You don't know this? I mean, so I think when we grow up with it, I mean, how many of us really question what we're presented at a curriculum? I think we're not taught, are we, to question the curriculum we're given at a university or a music school or something? I mean, are we?
I think to a certain extent that comes with someone who goes through the early music route, because there's a questioning of authority in general when you go from your kind of straight up classical music education to early music. But all I'm saying is actually you have the opportunity to ask those questions, but it doesn't necessarily mean you question the repertoire itself.
Yeah.
Well, we had a women composers module in my undergrad music degree, and I don't know how long it had been on the curriculum, but I remember it was a bit of a joke among the undergrads. I do remember that it was like forced in there. We thought, they're forcing in the women composers module, and of course it's interesting once you're in it, but when you're 20, and you've had your whole education up till then, and your whole exposure to classical music up till then has been very male dominated, then you think, women composers, okay, let's see what this is about, And now I'm thinking, I'd quite like to take that module again.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'd like to know what's on the module. Is there anyone I don't know? But the point is that it's a module, and of course then the rest is presumably male.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or identifying as male, and that's interesting too, because I mean, about our assumptions, I think that particularly in the early music scene, I mean, if you're talking about medieval manuscripts and stuff, a lot of the time we have no idea who wrote this, right? But our assumption would tend to be that it was a man.
Yeah.
And often that's not true. I mean, there must be a vast amount of medieval stuff that was actually written by nuns. I mean, it just, there's some evidence for it, and it just must have been the case.
Yeah.
But so what does that tell us about our assumptions of authorship being male? And I think it ties into the whole creative genius thing, that it's a single male authorship. I mean, that happens with a lot of paintings, that we want to know generally that it is an identifiable male person, and it's a workshop, and whoever was the main artist probably did the hands, because that's the difficult bit, and the face, but actually we're talking workshop production, and there might have been some women involved in that too, and so I think a lot of these things perhaps tell us more about ourselves than it tells us about history, or how history was, or how music was, or whatever else. And so I think things only really get interesting if one starts to question that.
I'd like to ask you one last serious question, and that go back to the blunt instrument of quotas.
Yes.
Right? Can you imagine what your reaction would be if you got the job that you would see as the peak of your career, and they said, we got you because we had a quota for women?
Doesn't bother me at all.
It wouldn't bother you?
Not in the slightest, because what's interesting to me is just conducting, the best I possibly can, getting the best out of the orchestra I can in that moment, whoever's there, with the music that's in front of me. And that fires me up every single time, every single minute. And I think there is so much discrimination, and a lot of it is subconscious, a lot of it is not very acknowledged, that if I got in because for that route, I don't think that means I wouldn't deserve to get in. I think that would just mean that actually a bit of discrimination could be circumvented.
Right.
Yeah. Because if they dared to say, we had a quota to fill, then I'd be thinking, what, do you think we're not good enough? Like, do you think you're sacrificing something or compromising by having that quota? Yeah.
No, that wouldn't bother me at all.
Okay. Because I mean, obviously the disparity is so massive that there's no excuse to say, by setting up a quota, we're going to be pumping people into leadership roles who who wouldn't necessarily qualify it if we just put a blind screen, or you know what I mean, if we somehow were able to wipe gender out of the selection process.
The problem with conducting, of course, being that you can't conduct behind a curtain for
Exactly.
your audition. It doesn't really work, right?
Exactly. So there's no way to get that out of the selection process, the subconscious bias. Or, yeah.
But even if you could do an audition where you didn't know who was behind the curtain and they were conducting,
And could judge.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Even if this were possible, I think you would still need the quota, because so many young girls don't have the opportunity to be inspired to take that role, or they don't have the training as a boy chorister when they're young, or they don't have a way into that organ and choral scene. I mean, I'm talking from a UK perspective. And at university, they feel a bit left out if they want to do that, you know. So I think if you didn't have the quota, you'd be in danger of still hiring the same people who have been doing this from the age of 8. So you do need to take, I mean, it's a kind of positive discrimination tactic, isn't it? You do need to take an active step to encouraging women to take on these leadership roles, because we're not encouraged when we're kids, and that's when you're around 10 years old is when it's a very formative time. And I was one of the lucky ones that at 10 I was already in a choir, and we had equal numbers of services to the boys. They got some special services that we weren't allowed to sing, and special pieces that we weren't allowed to sing because we were girls. But most of the girl chorister establishments in the UK only allow girls to start in high school, and the boys are allowed to start when they're very young. So I think that you do need. I think the curtain wouldn't work actually at the beginning.
Oh yeah. But what I was trying to get at was that I think if there was a way to eliminate the subconscious bias and not have quotas, I still think it would be 60-30 or 60-40 or you know, I still think there would be a disparity, but only to the level of the other arts in this study, you know, where we have, you know, classical music has a representation of 6.6% of conductors in major organizations, where you have 44% in I can't remember, I think it was theater or dance, but in any case you have far higher, you know, still not 50-50,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
or 60-40 in the opposite direction, but what I'm a little bit getting at is just that there's this younger generation than me, you know, early 20s now, who are coming out of North America, and they're saying, I don't want to be the person who's told I'm getting a job because they have, you know, like because of the way I look.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid point of view, but I think it's also a bit idealistic, because I think, fortunately, whatever, how you look does play a role, in fact. And I think that the most worrying thing is, if you like, people saying they have no bias. People saying, I mean, my very old school conducting teacher in Lugano used to say no difference between men and women conducting, but then he'd give all the jobs to the men. And so I think that it's always much more nuanced. So I think even the quotas thing wouldn't solve everything. And I think it's also a myth to think that means that the best women conductors will get the jobs, right? It's about a great many things. It's about who you know, and all sorts of other things as well, and how much we project. We're projecting all the time, and so anybody who thinks they're objective, well, they're kidding themselves. What the goal is to try and be as objective as possible, or to know your own subjectivity and take that into account, right? But it's incredibly hard to be objective, and so many factors always come into play. So quotas are not just going to sort everything out, but they would help to speed up one process of discrimination, to put that in some kind of perspective, to have some movement on that. So I think that would be a good thing. But I think there are all sorts of other things that need addressing as well. I think ageism is another problem, actually. You know, everybody's supposed to be 6 or something when they're starting, which particularly, as you're saying, for women, it's not going to happen, because they, you know, they don't often have the same opportunities or the same encouragement or the same role models around them, perhaps, or the same. It's not self-evident that they're going to step into a role of leadership. and therefore it might happen a little later or whatever. I think it's a very nuanced picture, and so no one thing is going to sort of change it. But that's not a reason to do nothing. On the contrary, that's a reason to do much more. But yeah, I think admitting one's own prejudices and starting to work on those is actually a way forward as well.
Yeah. This is really interesting because I feel like you're an example of somebody who's absolutely blasted the career path, and you're, at the top for that. And is there anything, I know there is for me, is there anything that you think helped you break through that and be successful as a woman conductor and in these leadership roles? Because I know that I get these pangs of guilt about my education. I know that without the privileged education and the pushy parenting and the money they put into music lessons, I feel like I wouldn't have been a female organ scholar, and I wouldn't have got into choral conducting, and I wouldn't have gone to that choir school that allowed girls in at the age of 9. So I'm okay. I landed on my feet, But is there anything that you think, if I didn't have that, it would have been much harder for me?
That's not just, coming back to what you said, that's not a reason to feel guilty about it. I think guilt's a complete waste of time. It might be a reason to try and change a situation for somebody else now, to try and give them the opportunities that you had, because it's not that you shouldn't have had those opportunities, it's that everybody should have that opportunity.
Everybody should have it,
right?
Exactly.
That's what we want to get to. Yeah. But no, I don't really, I did have a very privileged education, but I didn't come from a family that was at Oxbridge. My mother was tone deaf, I had a terrible straight-strung upright piano, which I did my first piano diploma practicing on. I didn't actually have sort of everything handed to me on a silver platter. I think I have some qualities which are useful or perhaps not always helpful. I am just extremely determined. I'm not going to. I have a strong sense of justice. Yeah. I do not like to see injustice anywhere, which is difficult because there's a lot of it around, and it takes a lot of time and energy if one is going to get worked up about that sort of thing. But weirdly enough, I suppose, gender actually doesn't interest me that much. That sounds crazy, because of course it does interest me. Because there's so much discrimination. But actually what interests me is conducting and music, and I want to do it in the best possible way and in the most just possible way. And so if I find then barriers, then I want to do something about that, and I don't accept that. I just don't think that is fair. The barriers that one finds are barriers to all of us actually getting the best out of life, reaching our full potential. And I think these barriers just shouldn't be there. So I suppose that not accepting that kind of status quo, I suppose. Mm-hmm.
Your determination, really.
Believing in what I'm doing, and all the rest is actually just not that interesting. Therefore, let's focus on that which is really, really interesting, right? And you can't imagine the feeling when you stand up and you're conducting a symphony by Amy Beach or something, and the whole orchestra that you're standing in front of, they don't know this piece. They have never, ever played or heard this piece. And then some of them come up to you and say, this is amazing. This is better than Dvorak. Why don't we know this? Why don't we play this all the time? And so, if you like, it gives you the confirmation, this is right, what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And it's not right because of this or that. It's right because we feel that together, because it really means something to us, because it helps us to grow, because it gives us an experience which is just exceptional in our lives. It's a great gift. I'm hugely lucky to be able to do what I do. It's a huge joy and a great privilege.
Jessica Horsley, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You're hugely welcome. It was great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
That's it from us this week. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like the video. We are actually also an audio podcast. We have 100 other episodes that you can listen to today if you want to. So please do check that out wherever you get your podcasts. So thanks for watching and take it easy.
See you next time.